You are watching Area DMG.
All right, this panel is going to be on the internment camps in the U.S. Of Japanese Americans during World War II. It's not a super happy panel. If you decide you want to go, it's fine. I will not be offended. My notes are just loading up now, so bear with me just a second. Is there anyone here who has like very little familiarity with this, or is everyone a little bit? Who here feels like they know pretty well about the internment camps? Cool, cool. So we're familiar with it. Has everyone heard George Takei talk about his experiences? Yes.
I have friends that seen his musical. It is fantastic.
Yeah, his musical is fantastic. I got to see it when they broadcast it in theaters here. They probably will again if you follow his Facebook for that musical. About once a year they tend to show it in like Cinemark, like on a one-day kind of thing. I'm sorry, you guys. It's just going to be a second. My phone is so old.
I have to do it from memory.
No! There's numbers involved. I want to have my facts. I definitely don't remember numbers. Alright, but we can start here. During World War II, Japanese Americans and Japanese people, anyone of Japanese descent, as well as a handful of other peoples who are Asian who got caught up in it. A handful of Chinese people, a handful of Korean people were locked up by the U.S. government in what the U.S. likes to call internment camps. However, they were prison camps. People were forcibly locked up in them, and they were concentration camps. That word's generally associated with Nazis. However, there were concentration camps before World War II. There are concentration camps now. Not death camps. Death camps are the ones where you put people there intending to kill them all. Of course, the Nazis used both. There is a distinction. And so we did the same thing with the Japanese. After Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, you guys are probably somewhat familiar with that. We were attacked. We reacted pretty much like after 9/11. We were like, you know, oh my God, someone attacked America. That never happens. We've got to react. Part of our reaction was, nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was part of it. And then people in the U.S. were terrified. A lot of them, and there were already a lot of racist sentiments towards the Japanese in the U.S. and towards most minorities at the time. So it was a really easy thing to say, all right, well, this happened, and see, we knew that this would happen because of these outsiders. The Japanese had finally begun being able to buy farms and things like this, the Japanese community, especially in California. It made the white community very angry. They felt like they're taking our jobs, they're taking our land, they're not really Americans, they're not learning the language, they're not adapting to our culture. This might sound familiar. It's what we've always said. It's what we said about the Irish when they first came over. Like, keep those Irish people out, they're all crazy. And then we said it about the Japanese, and now we're saying it about people from the Middle East. It's just, you know, that's the way that people tend to react when they're scared.
Everybody got their turn in the barrel.
Exactly. You got to go through. Everybody except for heterosexual land-owning white men are pretty much going to go through some crap throughout history.
Including Native Americans.
Of course, and the Native Americans.
The first ones.
Yeah, exactly. They were the first camps, and it wasn't all that different. In fact, the land that we built these locations on were largely Native American owned, or because they were in some of the worst parts of the country, which is of course where we put reservations, where, you know, there was no good land because everyone else wanted that, so we're going to put them where the land is worthless. Native Americans were not given an option about this. We were like, yeah, we're going to put a bunch of Japanese people on your land in a prison, so you just got to deal with it. They were paid a little bit of money, but not very much later on, to be compensated for the use of their land. At first, California, the West Coast was the first target area, but the vast majority of Japanese people lived on the West Coast. Hey, there's my notes, now I've got numbers. Yes, so the amount of people who were interned were 110,000 to 120,000 people. It's approximate because there were people who died, there were people who were born in these camps, and so we don't have exact numbers. The other reason, anytime you look at something like this, like an atrocity like this in the past, when there's not an exact number, that does generally tell you how much people cared about the people they were imprisoning. Right? There wasn't an exact count. It's a pretty big discrepancy. So Executive Order 9066 was President Franklin D. Roosevelt's order to allow regional military commanders to designate military areas from which, quote, any or all persons may be excluded. So basically first they said, well, Japanese people aren't allowed on the West Coast. Well, like almost all of them lived there. Almost all of them lived, and still a very large amount of Japanese people in California and Oregon, because of course that's where you land when you come over from Japan. So the community was very tight there. So the first thing they did was say, well, you can't be in California. You have to leave. And people who volunteered to leave first, they were told, okay, well, we're going to help you. You know, so come to us, we'll put you in this location, and then, you know, you'll be able to find a place to live elsewhere. And they left. And the reason that some of these people did volunteer to do this is because things were turning so dangerous for Japanese people on the West Coast. They thought that if they left, people would be happier. It's a very Japanese way of handling things. Instead of getting in the face of the problem, it's like, okay, we're just going to go with the flow. We'll get out of the way then. We don't want to cause problems. So...
When was that order signed?
That was in 1942? Yes, the year after Pearl Harbor. Because Pearl Harbor was December, so it was later in 1942. One thing, the census. Everyone here who's an adult has probably filled in information for the census. We do it every few years in the U.S., and it helps us tell, you know, 10 years, thank you. It was like, when was the last time we did it? And that allows the government to know statistics, age, religion, who lives where. And they're supposed to keep that information somewhat confidential. It's not supposed to be used against citizens. It's supposed to be there to help know what communities need assistance. And however, the Census Bureau did provide confidential information on Japanese Americans. They denied it. They were like, we didn't give the government any of this information. We didn't help them at all. We had nothing to do with it. They did. They just handed over all of it to the government willingly. They weren't forced. In 2007, they finally admitted that they were the ones that released the information that allowed the government to find the locations of all the Japanese Americans. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt was the head of the Western Command. He administered the internment program. He told newspapers that a Jap's a Jap. And it doesn't matter if they were born here, if their grandparents were born here, a Jap's a Jap, and their loyalty's going to lie with the emperor. And we can't trust them. What if they're enemy combatants? What if they're here stealing secrets and sending it back to Japan? So on January 2nd, Joint Immigration Committee of California Legislature, this was a really racist anti-Japanese organization. They, just not a government organization, just an organization of people. There were many of them who were anti-immigrant. Again, there are many organizations now that are racist organizations or anti-immigrant organizations. Of course, we've seen massive protests in the U.S. recently, and a lot of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups and the KKK have all come together, which is interesting because they don't usually go together. The neo-Nazis and the KKK, you know, the KKK are like, you're German, we don't want anything to do with you. But these days they're like, hey, we can all work together. So we're having mass protests now again. It's interesting because it's a little bit of history repeating itself. They sent a manifesto to California newspapers saying the quote-unquote ethnic Japanese, it said they're totally unassimilatable. Unassimilatable? They couldn't assimilate. unassimilable. They were basically saying that it was impossible for a Japanese person to become American. No matter how long they lived here, no matter how many generations, they just aren't American. They're never going to be, they don't want to be, they don't care. They're just here to take advantage of the freedoms that our country provides. The manifesto argued that all people of Japanese heritage were loyal subjects of the emperor. They were like, you know, it doesn't matter, they're going to follow what the emperor says. If the emperor says attack America, every Japanese person in this country is going to attack us and just start killing everybody because they're going to follow him blindly. They said that Japanese language schools were bastions of racism, which advanced doctrines of Japanese racial superiority. So of course most of the Japanese Americans did go to schools taught by other Japanese Americans. They were still submersed in their culture and their language. Some of the younger generation did not speak Japanese fluently anymore. It was very much like now, like your parents come over, they're fully Japanese. You grew up in America, you exist in this half and half world. You're very much an American, but you also have that culture of Japan at home. So another organization that was backing this up is the Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West and the California Department of the American Legion. The American Legion is still a very active organization. They try to associate themselves with the U.S. military, but the U.S. military is like, that's not us. And they put out a regular magazine that's presented as mainline journalism, but is hard right journalism. They tend to be actively a racist organization, although they deny it. So it's just one of those things where when you look at the media, you have to keep into account. You have to look at, like, okay, this is what this person's saying. What's their bias? Everyone has a bias. Even the people that you agree with are going to have a bias. And so at the time, however, people, you know, even now are not educated necessarily to look at news critically. I think that's one of the reasons we elect the people that we do on every side of the aisle. I think if Americans were as educated about politics as we could be if we had a better education system, if we were encouraged to, if we were taught about this, we'd probably have a completely different system of government. Less than half of Americans vote or get involved, so that changes things.
We wouldn't have a different system.
Yeah,
We wouldn't have a different system.
it would be It would be functioning more like the original intent, I think, than we are now. Is what I mean. Yeah, it would be functioning very differently.
We would all become
Different
communists or
people.
fascists or Nazis or any of those other political systems.
There are a lot of political systems. Yeah, I'm just saying. Yeah, we've gone away from some of the original intent, and of course, a lot of our people that created the Constitution were slave owners. So, you know, original intent has some meaning, but not all of them meant for slaves to be free eventually. And so, you know, everyone has bias. Everyone has different things they come from. In January of that year, they demanded that all Japanese with dual citizenship be placed in these concentration camps. Earl Warren, the Attorney General of California, began to persuade the federal government to remove all people of Japanese ethnicity from the West Coast. So, the Los Angeles Times editorial at the time said, quote, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents, nurtured upon Japanese traditions, living in a transplanted Japanese atmosphere, notwithstanding his normal brand of accidental citizenship, almost inevitably and with the rarest exception grows up to be a Japanese and not an American. Thus, while it might cause injustice to a few to treat them all as potential enemies, it cannot escape the conclusion that such treatment should be accorded to each and all of them while we are at war with their race." So it's a similar argument that we have right now to not allowing refugees in from Middle Eastern countries that are largely Islamic, because the idea is, well, the people that we're fighting come from this group, and how can we tell who we should let in and who we shouldn't? And how can we trust that the people here that have the same religion as them or come from the same culture as them aren't on their side? And that's scary when you've been attacked. You can understand how people would be terrified and think, well, they don't want to kill all of us, especially in a country like this, which, especially up until then, hadn't been attacked on U.S. soil. It was almost like, aren't we invincible? How could this happen? And then, oh my God, it did happen. It's going to happen again. We're terrified. Unfortunately, what happens when you take up the people at the bottom of your social ladder is that you create a labor shortage, a massive labor shortage. Japanese Americans were doing most of the farm work, most of the food work. They ran grocery stores. They did a lot of menial labor jobs that now we think of Latin American immigrants as majoritively taken care of. Ironically, one of the first mass immigrations from Mexico was to fill the jobs of the Japanese Americans who we had imprisoned. So I think it's kind of ironic that now we're like, oh, what are all these Mexicans doing here, taking our jobs? Like, well, actually they are taking the Japanese people's jobs. You weren't working that job anyway, it was actually Japanese American. So the camps were built mostly in the western interior of the country. 112,000 Japanese people resided on the west coast, and like I said, up to 120,000 people were interned, so almost all of them were from the west coast. 62% of the internees were United States citizens. That's despite the fact that at the time there had been a block on Japanese people becoming citizens. So there was a period of time where Japanese people could come in and become citizens like everyone else, and then the war happened and we were like, we're going to hold off on this citizenship thing. So a large amount of people that had been born here were not legal citizens at the time. 1 drop of Japanese blood was enough to be interred. If you had any Japanese blood in you at all, you counted. About 80,000 of the people there were Nisei, which means second-generation American-born Japanese people. So they had been born here, and so had their parents. And Sansei, third generation, and then the rest were first-generation immigrants. So there were first, second, and third generation people born in the U.S. The internment camps, the government still calls them internment camps. The Department of Justice officially labeled them that at the time because they were used to detain enemies, people with enemy sympathies, which is what, of course, they were accused of. The camps were in Texas, Idaho, North Dakota, New Mexico, Montana. There are also one in Colorado. Camps were run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service under the umbrella of the Department of Justice, guarded by the Border Patrol rather than military police. So those, of course, are different organizations, and there's different training that goes into being Border Patrol. Border Patrol people are not trained to run prisons for long periods of time. They certainly weren't then. So you're taking people that is not what they've been trained to do and putting them in charge of thousands of people who have been imprisoned. And they really didn't know what they were doing. But at first, there were 17 temporary civilian assembly centers where people were sent until the permanent relocation centers were completed. We started gathering people before we had completed the locations we were keeping them in. It was kind of a panic. It was the single largest forced relocation in U.S. history. This does not count Native Americans, that's pre-U.S. history, right? We're talking about post-U.S. government. This was the largest forced relocation in the country at that point.
My dad was living in North Hollywood going to high school when they were rounding everybody up. And my dad is extremely conservative, but he's even said that was the biggest mistake, and we shouldn't have done that. They were Americans, they were here, they were citizens, we should not have done that.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and like you said, conservatives and liberals alike tend to agree that we don't want to round up American citizens and lock them up. Traditional conservative values, you know, it's just one of the terms we use, are about limited government, and limited taxation and things like that. So the concept that you would lock up citizens is actually quite a large expansion of government. So it's interesting when things like that are supported by a conservative side of a political group, because again, I thought your point was that we should leave people alone more. But of course, when people are scared, we don't act in a way that we normally would. We act based on fear. There were 2 military restricted zones. One was in the southern half of Arizona and the western half of California, Oregon, and Washington. And the military area number 2 covered the rest of those states, so the western half of the country. Japanese Americans would be required to leave these zones and sent to the camps. They were free to leave anywhere outside the exclusion zone, so they could have left California and gone east. However, the period of time when that was allowed was just until March 27th, and then they weren't allowed to leave either. So they weren't allowed to be there, and they weren't allowed to leave. So they had about 2 months to get out of the West Coast, leave everything behind. A very small handful of people did. Most people couldn't do that. So they couldn't leave, they couldn't stay. So then they were all brought in and arrested. Civilian exclusion order number 1, eviction, began from the West Coast on March 24th, 1942. In Colorado, we did have an internment camp in the southeast of the state. However, Colorado Governor Ralph Lawrence Carr was the only elected official to denounce the internment. So we can be proud of that in Colorado history. That governor actually tried to stand up for this and stop it.
That's why he lost the election.
And then he lost the following election. And, you know, but although he lost the election, he did gain the gratitude of the Japanese community, and there's a statue of him at Sakura Square. If you go down there, there's actually a statue of him down there, which is very, very cool to know our local connections with these things, because it's important. Some of the people of Colorado wanted this, but it shows that some people really didn't and were willing to stand up against it. Colorado, even to this day, is a state that, although we're purple and we have a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals and a lot of people on the far ends in the middle of everything you can imagine, we do tend to stand up for human rights more than a lot of other states, even in more conservative areas. Our leaders, even the ones that are more conservative, tend to be more humanitarian. I think that that's part of the culture of Colorado that brings people here. That and the love of environment, maybe that compassion goes hand in hand. The conditions of the camps. Secretary of the Interior, Harold L. Eccles, in 1943 wrote, quote, "The situation in at least some of the Japanese internment camps is bad and rapidly becoming worse." In the 1943 War Relocation Authority report, they said internees were housed in, quote, "tar paper-covered barracks of simple frame construction without plumbing or cooking facilities of any time." They barely met with international laws of what you have to provide to prisoners. Barely. But many of the camps were built quickly by civilian contractors within a few weeks. So they were basically just shacks and very poorly constructed row houses, prison houses. There would be a central area with a cafeteria where everyone had all of their meals together every day. Public bathrooms where there were no stall walls, so everyone used, just like in prison, there's no privacy at all. And multiple family units were living in these houses together. Sometimes there weren't enough beds, they'd squish in together. This happened, of course, it was going on for years. The designs of the buildings were based on military barracks. So they were very poorly equipped for family living. They were intended for the military. 25 people were often forced to live in a space intended for 4 people. The Japanese saying shikataganai, which basically translates to "it can't be helped," was a saying that was very common. And you can view this, some people viewed this as, oh, Japanese people, they won't fight back, they just don't care. They're like, we can't do anything about it. But really, the meaning of it was you have to be strong when the situation is something you can't change. It's not give up, it's more like endure. You can't do anything, so keep your head down and try not to let it crush you because you can get through it. However, the American, of course, perception of that attitude was those lazy Japs. They don't care. Medical care in the camp was extremely limited. Japanese doctors were allowed to work if they were born in the U.S., and then there was additional healthcare staff brought in. The recommendation is for 1 physician out of every 1,000 inmates and 1 nurse to every 200 inmates. This was never met. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, they were not able to keep people healthy and preventative health care. So once you got sick enough to be seen, you were very sick. There wasn't enough medicine. People were dying of basic things that could have been treated because of the conditions and the lack of health care. Sometimes they did have to bribe the doctors if they were outsiders that came in order to, my kid needs this medicine, this is what we have. Food poisoning was really common because the food that they were getting was poor quality. As the camps became more entrenched, they did grow their own food, they did have farming. They were, of course, forced to take care of all of that themselves, even though they were underfed. And, of course, the locations they were in had very poor conditions. The land was bad, there was no rain, or they were in the deep south where it was a swamp. So it was almost impossible to keep up on food. The people that were in Topaz, Minidoka, and Jerome experienced outbreaks of dysentery. A lot of diseases that are normally not seen anymore, even at the time, were common because of conditions that were not clean. There were not medical supplies, medications, surgical equipment, sterilization. If you had to have a surgery, it was just in a room in the doctor's office. They didn't have anything sterilized. There were not enough staff. The Japanese medical workers, no matter how equipped they were demoted to positions below the white employees. So they brought in white doctors who often were very low level because the pay was so poor, and they made sure that that person was above the Japanese doctor. The pay for a Japanese doctor was $20 a month. At Heart Mountain, Japanese American doctors received $19 a month. White nurses were getting paid $150 a month. $150 a month, even for those white nurses, was very little money, so few of them wanted to go. The people that tended to end up working in these locations who were not Japanese white, because they weren't allowing other minorities to go work there, were generally people who, for some reason, couldn't find work elsewhere. Maybe they weren't as good, maybe they didn't have experience. The extreme climate was very hard on infants and the elderly. Of course, there were children, many children born in these camps and grew up in these camps. And you can imagine growing up behind barbed wire with machine guns pointed at you your whole childhood, and how that would be normal because you wouldn't know anything else. And there were dust storms in the west, caused asthma. In Arkansas, they were in swampy, mosquito-infested land. There were almost 6,000 live deliveries in the camps. There were about 1,800 deaths, including cancer, heart disease, tuberculosis, vascular disease. So they were not a healthy place to be. It was very terrifying because if you were elderly or had a baby, you were very scared you were going to lose your family members. Education was provided in the camps, of course, but it was mostly used to indoctrinate people who they thought were anti-American. The ironic thing was, most of these people were highly patriotic Americans. Most of the people were, they came here for a reason. They didn't want to be in Japan. They came to America for the same reason people come here now, because it's safer, because it's a better life, because they've heard there's more acceptance. They didn't come because they wanted to do what the emperor said. So often what you'll find is a lot of children, they did the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning. That's the way these people grew up. 30,000 people in these camps were children. Schoolhouses were completely crowded. There weren't enough books. There weren't enough pencils. Some of the locations didn't even have desks. English was the only language instruction was in. Japanese was banned. They didn't want kids learning their language or their culture at all. People taught Japanese in the barracks at night when it was just the families. They were not supposed to be spreading any of that. They had wood stoves to heat the buildings, like in the 1800s and before, rather than anything else. They had no libraries. They had no library books. They had nothing to read. They had no writing desks. They had no science equipment. They were basically in prison blocks. They often had no windows, or maybe one window that was very small, so the temperatures would go very high. Classes would get so hot from cramming all the students in them that sometimes they would pass out, and they would just have to take the children outside so that they wouldn't die. The class sizes were immense. You usually had a 48-to-1 teacher ratio, so there was one teacher for about every 48 kids for elementary school, one for every 35 kids in secondary school. The average of the time was one teacher for every 28 children in the US. So, very, very bad teacher shortage. There was actually a teacher shortage in the whole of the country at the time. So no one wanted to leave and go live in these internment camps. You couldn't live outside of them and teach in them. So if you wanted to work in an internment camp as a non-Japanese person, you had actually to live there. So you were living in these poor conditions. You were getting paid almost nothing. One of the teachers wrote, "There was persistent mud or dust, heat, mosquitoes, poor food and living conditions, inadequate instructional supplies, and a half-mile or more walk each day just to and from the school block." They tripled the salary for teachers in the hopes to bring them in. They weren't able to find anyone. So they started hiring people who were not certified teachers, just anyone, like, "Do you want to teach?" come teach. We need someone to run this class with no books. The curriculum was mostly based on the study of, quote, the democratic ideal and to discover its many implications. The kids that left were actually highly undereducated in things like math and science, literature, all the basics that we consider now that everyone should study, and they mostly came out having been taught purely propaganda about the government. Not that there aren't a lot of wonderful things about our country, but they certainly were not taught about anything but the positive. They wanted to create a 100% patriotic Japanese-American community. The kids were having to teach their parents English. It was part of their job. They were told, when you go home at night, you have to teach your parents and your grandparents. They don't speak the language, they're not allowed to speak Japanese. So the children, even very small kindergarten children, were told, you have to go teach them. And if they failed to, there was punishment. There was a lot of pressure. Sports, however, were played in the camps. When you put a bunch of people together like that and tell them you have to live here, instead of falling apart, the community decided we're Americans, we're going to play baseball. And so in most of these places, they just came together and made sports teams, baseball, basketball, all this. Hockey, sometimes they had to make all of the equipment. Sometimes someone would bring in some sports equipment. Sometimes they literally made baseball bats out of branches, if there were any trees. That actually created quite a sense of community, which lacked otherwise. There was theater, there was acting, there was music, there were choruses, there were churches. They weren't supposed to practice their Shinto or Buddhist religion, but a lot of them were already Christian. Many, many Japanese Americans were Christian at this point. They had already mostly assimilated, and some of them came to America because they were Christian, because Christianity was really discouraged in Japan. At this point, it's just kind of an odd novelty. You'll see Christian images in anime sometimes, and it'll be a cross, and sometimes they'll put like the Star of David on it, and they're like, this is how you summon demons. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Sure, something like that. If you've ever seen classic anime like Devil Hunter Yoko, there's a lot of that. There's an episode of Sailor Moon where they go and a Catholic priest helps them because there's like a Yoma that they have to fight. And it's just like, you're trying to get this right. So they mostly came to America to try to be around other Christians. The conditions were horrible. This went on for years. Many Japanese men wanted to go fight in the war. They were American. They wanted to go fight the Germans. They wanted to go over to Asia and fight on behalf of the Americans against Japan. They felt attacked as well. For a long time, they weren't allowed to join up. When they finally were, it was a difficult process, but you could apply and go join the military. It was one of the ways to get out of the camps. Your family had to stay. Oftentimes, their family members died while they were fighting for the country. So you have to imagine being a man who's in Europe, in Asia, risking his life, and knowing that your family might be dying in a camp in the country you're fighting for. It's a very strange relationship to have with your native land. If you ever watch, if people were in my video panel last night about Japanese people in American cinema, The Karate Kid has a really good scene where Mr. Miyagi talks, well, he's drunk, but they discuss the fact that he was in a camp and his wife died in childbirth. This really happened. George Takei of Star Trek grew up in one of these camps. They went when he was, I believe, 4 years old. He said that he didn't even know what was going on. He thought that they were going on a trip. He didn't understand. Kids don't know what's going on. They were surrounded by barbed wire. They had machine guns pointed at them. People did get killed by the guards occasionally if they tried to escape, if they fought with the guards, or if the guards were having a bad day. Occasionally these things happen. Again, these people weren't trained to be prison guards.
I heard about one where, it was in one of the documentaries I watched, where a Japanese American went up to the guard tower and yelled at the guard, "We're Americans, you can't treat us this way," and they shot him.
Right. Yeah. So, you can also find, you can study, there are a lot of fascinating psychological and sociological studies about what happens when you create prisoners and prison keepers. And that people who would normally never be abusive, who are incredibly kind people, you put them in a situation where that's the norm and you tell them that person's bad and you're good and everyone around them thinks that way, and even people who think I would never behave that way begin to. It's really fascinating if you ever study sociology any of that in school, you'll find these studies. And there was quite a famous one where they recreated a prison, and the teacher who did it stopped the experiment early because he found himself beginning to abuse the students who were supposed to be prisoners violently. And he was like, oh my God, if I'm doing this, and it became very severe. He had to shut the study down. That's happened a lot in the past. So you can see how someone who perhaps had good intentions ends up in this situation and turns violent against the people there. In 1944, an executive order was signed and people were released. The Supreme Court made two decisions. The Korematsu versus United States, which said the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast was constitutional. So kicking them out of the West Coast, the United States government found that's legal. However, Ex parte Endo said loyal citizens of the United States, regardless of cultural descent, could not be detained without cause. So kicking Japanese people out of the West Coast, totally legal. Putting American citizens in prison, not legal. That's what the government decided. It was not rescinded, however, until January 2nd of 1945. And then the reason is that it was postponed until after the November 1944 election. Roosevelt wanted this to end, but he wanted to get reelected. And he knew that if he released the Japanese before then, he would not win the election. So he waited, and once he had been reelected, he opened up the camps. There are studies about how many people died in the interim. You know, how many people were affected by that. On the other hand, you can look at political history and say, well, would things have been worse off if he wasn't the one who won that election? It's just another fascinating debate to have. Was it better or worse for him to do that? Many of the younger internees had already resettled in the Midwest or eastern cities. You could get out of the camps, like I said, by going to the military. Occasionally you could by going to a university. It was very difficult. Almost everyone who applied was rejected. However, some of them were allowed to go. They did not come back to the West Coast because they were not allowed to. 20,000 people were sent to Lakeview, Chicago, for instance, as they emptied it. The remaining population began to leave. Former inmates were given $25 and a train ticket to where they came from. So they were allowed back to the West Coast. Now, in the meantime, all of their belongings had been left. They were allowed when the police came, when the military police came to arrest them, to bring perhaps a suitcase, a bag, family members, and that was it. They left their homes. People were given a couple of days' notice, sometimes a week's notice. If they were fortunate, they could sell some of their belongings, but the communities took advantage of them because they knew that, oh, you need to sell your convenience store because you're going to be imprisoned. I'll give you 1% of what it's worth, and they had to take it. So they had nothing. They had no homes, they had no businesses, they had no money, they had no community. Everything had been destroyed. Some people did go back to Japan. Almost all of them were sent back to the United States by the Japanese. They were like, you're not Japanese, you're Americans, go back, you're not allowed here. So they weren't wanted in either country. The camps remained open for people who weren't ready to return immediately, like the elderly, people with very young children. However, they slowly got rid of them by eliminating services. So they were like, okay, well, there's just no kitchen anymore. You just have to leave. People who refused to leave were eventually forced back to the West Coast the same way they were forced to the camps by machine gun. So at this point, alien land laws on the West Coast barred the Japanese from owning their pre-war homes and farms. So many of them, when they had been arrested, had not been able to own anything anyway. The ones that did, like I said, they lost everything. Speculators made a ton of profit, bought it, sold the land to someone else. June 1945, a writer, a journalist, described how the Japanese Americans had grown increasingly depressed and overcome with feelings of helplessness and insecurity, even after they were told that they were going to be released, because what were they supposed to do? Many of the children didn't want to leave, because they were like, why are we leaving home? They'd never been outside the barbed wire. They didn't know why they were being forced to leave. After release, there were large numbers of attacks on Japanese people within the U.S. lots of racism. Most of it happened in the rural areas of Central California. Unfortunately, you'll often find that there's more racism, xenophobia, homophobia, sexism in more rural areas because, of course, education isn't as good, and you're going to be more fearful of something that's different if you haven't encountered it before. When you live in an urban area, you see more people who are different. You're used to it. If you live in a small area and you're told these people are evil, it's easy to believe it. You've never seen anything different. It's also why, you go to a city right now and you're going to find a more liberal atmosphere. You go to the countryside, you're going to find a more conservative atmosphere. It's also why right now you're going to find that there is a mass inter-country migration happening, where we have more liberals moving into cities right now in the U.S. and more conservatives leaving cities than before. You may have noticed your rent has shot up in Colorado and in a lot of other places in the last few years. Part of it's the political climate. After Trump was elected, huge numbers of conservatives moved to the country, huge numbers of liberals began to move to cities. We're self-segregating a lot more in this country. We don't want to be around each other. We're scared of each other. It's not that dissimilar. Dozens of reports of gunshots, fires, explosions aimed at Japanese-American homes, businesses, temples, even their churches. There were countless nonviolent crimes, vandalism, things like Japs go home, you're not wanted, Japs not wanted here. In fact, it's fascinating that you'll actually find a lot of that even in African-American businesses, even in Latin American businesses. The minority communities were also turned against each other, which you'll find now also sometimes. Instead of banding together and saying, this is happening to you, it could happen to me, it was, you're outsiders, we're American. And I think that sometimes there's a little bit of, oh, we're not the ones being oppressed, we're part of the group now. And it's easy to get to that point. So the Japanese were largely isolated. The Chinese-American community also was not as welcoming as they could have been because there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in Japan and a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in China. And of course, during World War II, Japan occupied a lot of China and attacked it and did a lot of the same brutal things that Germany did in Europe. We don't study as much in the West. It's really interesting. And so other Asian Americans didn't want to help them. Like, no, you're from this country that's destroying mine. In one of the only cases to go to trial against racist attacks, 4 men were accused of attacking the Doi family of California, setting off an explosion and starting a fire on the family's farm in January of 1945. One of the men actually confessed and said, yeah, we did it, we're proud of it. But the jury accepted their defense attorney's framing of the attack as a justifiable attempt to keep California, quote, a white man's country, and all 4 defendants were acquitted. The jury was like, yeah, they were only doing what was right, trying to save white people by blowing up a family farm. In 1948, on July 2nd, the U.S. Congress passed the American Japanese Claims Act, allowing Japanese people to apply for compensation for their time in the camps. The way it was phrased, however, was they were allowed compensation for property losses which occurred as a, quote, responsible and reasonable consequence of the evacuation or exclusion. So yes, we're going to give you some money, but remember, what we did was legal. The IRS had already destroyed most of the Japanese Americans' tax records, however, so they had no evidence that they deserved anything. Almost none of them were able to keep their financial records. Almost none of them got any money. There was $148 million in requests, $37 million went out. So essentially, no one got back anywhere near what they would need to reestablish their families. There is a redress movement for property losses, broader injustice, mental suffering, economic suffering. In 1976, President Gerald Ford proclaimed that internmentship was wrong and a national mistake which should never be repeated. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in 1980, Jimmy Carter, that peanut president, he had an investigation to see if internment was lawful. He believed that it was not. He was a Democrat. He ran on a socially liberal platform. He was encouraging, he was trying to push through things like socialized health care, socialized college, the ending of repressing of minorities. He was Southern, but he was very, very active in the anti-racism actions at the time. The Commission report found little evidence of Japanese disloyalty and found that the incarceration had absolutely been due to racism. Of course, this wasn't until 1980. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law, which, you know, again, a conservative, these days, you know, we want to say, you know, liberals just want to let everyone into the country, and conservatives hate everybody, but of course that's not the truth. Reagan is well known for being a very conservative man. He apologized on behalf of the U.S. government, authorized payments of $20,000, so the equivalent to about $41,000 in 2016 to each camp survivor. The legislation admitted that the government's actions were based on race, prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. I think sometimes it would be good for our current government and the government of the past few generations, of the past few elections, to keep in mind that even Reagan was willing to go up and apologize for actions that this country took that ultimately we knew were wrong. It does not show weakness for a political figure to acknowledge these things. It shows strength, in my opinion. The government eventually dispersed more than $1.6 billion in reparations to 82,000 Japanese Americans who had been interned and their heirs. In 1992, the Civil Liberties Act amendments passed, appropriating an additional $400 million to all the remaining internees to ensure that they got their $20,000 redress payment, because not all of them had. President George H.W. Bush signed that into law, another Republican, George W. Bush, who now has been attacked for for doing things that hurt a lot of minority communities. But there's an example of something that he did do to fix some of the problems of the past. People are complicated. The 2001 budget of the United States said that Congress authorized 10 detention sites to be preserved as historical landmarks. You can go to the detention site that is in Colorado. Most of the buildings have been torn down in most of these locations. They're falling apart because they were never well built in the first place, but you can go. There are statues, there are landmarks. I encourage you to take some road trips down and check these out. It's much different to be in a location where something like this happened than to see pictures or to hear about it. Being in the place, you can really feel the impact. I think that when we look at things like this, the most important thing to do is be aware that it can happen again.
People are already saying they want to move Muslims to camps.
Yeah, exactly. Right now we are.
For like the last 8 months, people
Right,
are
we're trying to
move
ban
Muslims to camps.
Islamic people from coming to the country. The nation ban that Trump has tried to pass repeatedly, it's still being denied by various judges. He keeps trying to pass it, it keeps getting denied, keeps trying to pass it, keeps getting denied. We don't know what's going to happen because he's going to keep attempting it by changing the wording, by changing the way he files it, to try to find a way around these judges who don't want it to be passed. Despite the fact that when he was running, he said it was with the purpose of banning Muslim peoples, he now says that it has nothing to do with that, that it's because of the specific countries. Of course, those are all majority Muslim and Islamic countries. It's important to keep in mind that now it's even more difficult to be a refugee or to move to the United States. It takes a very long time, many years, ridiculous amounts of background checks. If you want to get into this country to do something to attack us, you're not going to do that. You're going to get on an airplane and you're going to overstay your visitor visa. It's a lot easier to get through that way than to do refugee status. Almost all refugees are women and families. There's almost never any single men, even if they're highly educated. So when we look at whether or not we should be allowing refugees in and whether or not we should be imprisoning American citizens, I think it's important to look at the facts and not act based on fear, which is an understandable thing to do. Anytime there's a new group of people and you're scared, it's a lot easier to say, well, let's just get rid of them. The important thing to remember is that we're all mixed in this country, and at some point, every single one of us has had ancestry that was hated by someone in this country, whether you were Irish, Italian, Catholic, religion, where you're from in this country. We've all been there, and one of the reasons that it hasn't stuck around, that we've moved through these things, is because people come together against them. The Japanese American community has spoken out very, very strongly against interning American citizens and refugees, and against the blocking of refugees coming into the country. They're one of the most active groups trying to stop the current legislation against refugees and against sending people out of the nation. So the Japanese community is really coming together to try to help others, which is great because they've learned through their experience. Many of the families that were affected by this never regained the economic status they would have had. Many of them came from families where the parents were educated, but their kids grew up uneducated. So when you then go to college, you're starting from a lower point. You're starting in poverty. You're starting without good nutrition. All of these things affect your life and the life of the people who you have later. Your grandchildren are impacted by this. So these actions don't just affect the people who are there at the time, but generations and generations later. You've lost a workforce, you've lost people who possibly could have invented new things or been in public government. And the best thing for a nation to do is utilize all of its people to the best of their potential, and we blocked a lot of them. We could have used a lot of those people in the military, for instance. Right now, on a last note, Trump tried to block transgender people from entering the military, and he did just try to kick out many of them. There are many, Purple Hearts who are transgender. That has also been blocked. And so in the same way that we tried to block Japanese people from joining the military and from being around, we need those people if we're going to be involved in wars. We need more people, not to fight each other. And if you follow what the Japanese American community believes, that's their message. I'd encourage people to go to Los Angeles anytime you're there. Little Tokyo is a very cool place. There's a lot of really great anime stores and ramen places, and you can get some okonomiyaki. And you can go to the Japanese American Museum. It's got a history of this. You can see a lot of the artifacts remaining. They have countless recordings. You can actually sit and listen to people talking about their experiences, videos. It's really touching. It's really incredible. The museum covers all of Japanese American history, but the ground floor is all about the internment. It's really fascinating. I think it's free or a few dollars.
I'm from Wyoming, and if you happen to be up in that area, you're going to go like to Yellowstone, Jackson. If you go through and you actually stop in Cody, about 45 minutes outside is Heart Mountain, and they have recreated the barracks, and you can walk through it to a museum, and all of the money goes to like funding, from the museum goes to funding stuff in Wyoming to help with people who've been relocated. Is really cool. So if you get an opportunity and you're up in that area, go stop by, because you can actually walk through the barracks and you can see some of like I think the hospital chimney's still there. Mm-hmm. They're trying to preserve that area.
Yes.
If you want more information, there's a really good documentary called The Cats of Merikatani.
Yes.
And he was actually an elderly Japanese American that a journalist had found living on the streets around 9/11. And he was in the camps. He had actually, his parents had sent him back to Japan to go to school. But when Japan asked him to join the military, he left and returned to America because he didn't want to be in the military. He was an artist. And then he was immediately interred in the camps. And they took away his citizenship. They tricked him into signing paperwork to take away their citizenship. And because he was essentially homeless when he got out, he never got it back. So even in 2001, he still thought he was an illegal person, and he was living on the streets, reliant on friends and getting paid by cash, and so that the whole documentary is researching the camps and trying to get him to reconnect and see family and stuff like that. And on top of that, he had family in Hiroshima, and it's a really very good documentary.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information out there on it. Yes.
I was just going to add to it. There's a Colorado PBS documentary about Camp Mache on YouTube. It's about an hour long, and it's just about a mache, and that's it. And there's also a very hard to watch but very well done animation about one of the camps in California. And I forget the name of it, but you can find it just by typing in Japanese Internment animation.
Japanese Internment animation, yeah. There's tons of documentaries, there's tons of books. Look up George Takei, he's done a lot of talking about it, it's fascinating. Thank you for coming. Pay attention to the world, vote accordingly. Listen to multiple sources, and don't let fear bias your actions. You can be smarter than that. Thank you for coming in.